Jack Thompson had always been good at keeping secrets, but this time, it was heavier than anything he had ever experienced. It all began simply, like most stories do. Jack and Evan Parker had been best friends since 3rd grade, always side by side, sharing everything. But no one, not even Evan, could have known what was brewing inside Jack as he began to step into adulthood. Evan's father, David Parker, was the type of person who left a strong impression without even trying. At 52, David still kept in shape with his construction job and early morning runs. His confidence, combined with the subtle authority in his words and gestures, made it impossible for Jack not to be drawn to him. Though Jack had never questioned his own sexuality before, David had been on Jack's mind for a long time, always the image of the man Jack secretly longed to become. But somewhere along the way, Jack's admiration had slowly turned into something deeper. Something he never expected and certainly never wanted. It shouldn't have been like this, especially with Evan's father. Jack first realized something had changed on a lazy summer afternoon. Evan had invited Jack over as usual to have some beers and play video games, but Evan had gotten drunk and passed out early, leaving Jack alone in the kitchen, sipping his drink and pondering the irony of fate that he was in David's house, all alone. David walked into the room with a calm demeanor and a smile. "It's late," David's deep voice echoed, making Jack's heart race. He nodded, sensing a strange tension in the air. "Yeah, Evan's asleep," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. David chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on Jack longer than usual. He never knows how to handle his liquor. Jack wasn't sure how to respond next, but he could feel the space around him shifting. David leaned against the kitchen counter, his broad shoulders filling the gap between them, creating an intimacy Jack had never felt so clearly before. "How's everything going?" David asked, his tone casual, though his eyes held a much stronger intensity. Jack hesitated, unsure of how to answer. He felt the weight of everything he'd been carrying for so long, late-night thoughts, confusion, and most of all, his growing attraction to David. "Just school stuff, nothing major," Jack replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. David didn't take his eyes off Jack, and Jack could feel the heat rising to his cheeks. "There's a lot to deal with, I get it," David said, his voice softening. "But if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm always here." That sentence, along with David's gaze, made Jack shiver. It was just a casual offer, like any father would say to a friend of his child, but the way David said it made Jack feel that something was off. And that was only the beginning of the unforgettable moments that followed, when Jack began spending more time at Evan's house, even when Evan wasn't around. There was always an excuse to come back, whether it was forgetting his notebook or just stopping by after school. But the truth was, Jack just wanted to see David. One evening, when Evan went to visit his mother and wasn't home, Jack happened to stop by, unaware that Evan was gone. David invited him in, and they sat in the living room making small talk. But the air between them was thick with tension, something Jack couldn't deny any longer. "You've been coming around a lot lately?" David spoke up, his eyes never leaving Jack. Jack swallowed hard, trying to keep calm. "Yeah, I guess so." David leaned forward, his expression becoming more serious. "You don't have to pretend, I know." Jack felt the ground beneath him give way. He tried to act innocent, pretending not to understand what David was referring to, but David's gaze said it all. They both knew for a long time, but they had never admitted it. Scene 5. And then, in those heavy moments when they couldn't hold back any longer, both crossed the line. But all it did was make everything more complicated, impossible to turn back. Jack knew that from now on, nothing would ever be the same. The mood between Jack and Amelia was tense, impossible to sever. In the silence, all that could be heard was the heavy breathing and their eyes locked in a silent struggle, each fighting with their own emotions. They stood facing each other, not knowing what to say next. Jack, sighing, "We can't go back now, can we?" Amelia remained silent, her hands trembling as she clenched them tightly. She looked at Jack, her gaze filled with pain but also determination. Both understood that they had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. Everything between them would never be the same again. Amelia, voice shaking, I don't know. I can't even begin to think about what will happen after this. But I feel like I've done something unforgivable. Jack stepped closer, his eyes filled with conflict. He didn't know what to do to fix the situation, but deep down, a clear truth was starting to surface. They couldn't go back to their old lives. Jack, slowly. I feel the same. But we can't change what's already happened. It's too late now. All I know is that nothing will ever be the same. They both stood still, looking at each other in silence. Their relationship had taken a turn from which there was no return. The moments between them felt heavy, the stillness only heightening the sense of foreboding. Jack, she said slowly, her voice carrying a dangerous tone, I know what you and David did. Jack's heart seemed to stop. His whole body went rigid, the blood draining from his face. He tried to stay calm, but Amelia's words thundered in his mind. What are you talking about? Jack stammered, trying to play innocent. Amelia smiled coldly, her expression completely emotionless. Don't play games anymore. I've seen everything. You think I didn't know? From the moment you started spending so much time at our house, I suspected. But now I'm sure. Jack took a step back, feeling like the ground beneath him was crumbling. She knew. But what would happen next? He looked at Amelia in horror, but she just stood there, eerily calm. They stood silently for a long moment before Amelia spoke, her voice lower than before. David is my husband, but there are things you don't understand about us, she said, her gaze never leaving Jack's. You think you're the only one caught up in this? Jack felt his confusion deepen. He didn't know what to say, and the silence between them made everything feel suffocating. Amelia took a step toward him, her threat becoming more evident with each movement. You have no right to judge us, Amelia continued, her voice suddenly full of menace. You're just a small part in this game. Jack could hardly breathe. He had thought he was the only one keeping secrets. But now he realized things were far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. He was caught in a whirlwind with no way out. Back at the cabin, Jack sat motionless in a chair, his mind spinning with chaotic thoughts. Amelia prepared a simple lunch, but he couldn't swallow a single bite. Her words from this morning still echoed in his head. She knew everything, but why had she brought him here? What did she want from him? As dusk fell, Jack knew he had to do something. He couldn't stay here for another minute. But when he opened the door to leave, Amelia stood in his way, her eyes filled with determination and authority. You're not going anywhere, Jack, she said coldly. Not until we're finished. Jack took a step back, his heart racing. He didn't know what to do, only that one thing was clear. She was in control of everything. The next morning, when Jack woke up, he realized he was no longer in the cabin. Instead, he was lying on a bed in a strange room. The tension in the air was overwhelming, and when the door opened, David stepped inside, his eyes full of mystery. Good morning, Jack, David said, his voice warm yet authoritative. It's time for you to understand everything now. Jack felt as though the world around him was collapsing. Not just Amelia, but David knew everything, and now he was trapped between the two of them. Secrets, psychological games, and consequences waiting to explode. In the following days, grief seemed to weigh heavily on Lucas and Derek. The once warm house was now cold, filled with the echoes of a broken past. Both couldn't escape the suffocating silence. The distance between them growing wider as each of them tried to cope with the aftermath of the tragedy in their own way. Lucas returned to school, but his heart was no longer there. Every class, every hallway seemed haunted by Ben's image. His friends tried to reach out, offering condolences, but Lucas kept his distance. He couldn't talk about it, couldn't think about it, without feeling a heavy wind of guilt. In his mind, that day kept replaying, wondering if there was a moment he could have stopped everything. As for Derek, on the other hand, he withdrew completely. He quit his job, stopped answering his phone, and barely left the house. Every room reminded him of Amelia, of who she once was and what she had become. His nights were filled with nightmares, where he saw Ben's lifeless eyes, heard Lucas's agonized screams, and felt Amelia's desperate embrace as she cried in his arms. There was no way to escape the guilt that consumed him. The trial passed in a blur. Amelia was declared unfit to stand trial and was sent to a mental health facility. She became a ghost of herself, silent and unresponsive to anyone, even during the court sessions. The media exploited the story, the wife, the husband, the lover. But for Lucas and Derek, it was just another reminder of the pain they had to endure. After the verdict, Lucas couldn't take it anymore. He packed his things, dropped out of school, and disappeared, hoping distance would lessen the pain. He needed to escape the heavy memories that clung to his life. Before leaving, he stood before his childhood home one last time, the walls once filled with love and laughter, now haunted by tragedy. He whispered a farewell to his old life and drove away, not knowing if he would ever find peace. Derek stayed behind, a man lost in himself. He spent most of his time alone, consumed by what-ifs and regrets. If only he had paid more attention to Amelia's cries for help. If only he had been honest with her before it was too late. If only he hadn't let Ben into their lives in the first place. There were no answers, only the unbearable guilt gnawing at him. Years passed, but the wounds never healed. Lucas wandered from place to place, searching for a normal life that he feared he would never find. He tried to build a new life, but no matter where he went, the past pursued him like a ghost. Ben's death, his mother's madness, his father's silence, all of it remained present, an indelible pain in his soul. As for Derek, he sank into the shadows of the small town, forgotten by time and gossip. People still whispered about Amelia, tears welling up, her voice barely a whisper. "We've ruined everything, everything we had." Jack, tilting his head. I know. He stood there, feeling the pain as if he were the one responsible for it all. But at the same time, he knew that they were both to blame and everything had already gone too far to be saved. "We can't go back, Jack, never." She turned her face away, unable to look him in the eye anymore. The guilt, the regret, and the fear tore at her heart. Everything now was broken into fragments. Nothing was whole anymore. Jack, sighing. "So, what do we do now?" They stood there in the cold air as the darkness slowly enveloped them. The feeling that they had lost everything they had built together weighed heavily on them. There was no escape, no chance to fix things. The only option now was to face the truth. "Amelia, I don't know. I can't even think about it, but maybe it's time to end it." Jack, raising his hand to wipe his face. Maybe that's it." A heavy silence passed, and neither of them said another word. The sense of loss filled the air, like a warning of what had happened and what was yet to come. Jack sat across from Amelia Parker, in the small kitchen of the cabin. The light from the overhead lamp cast shadows, making the darkness in the room feel even more oppressive, increasing the tension inside Jack. He tried to chew each bite of food, but his throat felt tight. Amelia's words from the previous night echoed in his head. "Sometimes people do things they regret, but in the end, we have to live with the consequences." Amelia sat across from him, her gaze calm but filled with unspoken meaning. The air between them was thick with tension, something Jack couldn't avoid. He tried to stay composed, but with every passing second, it felt like something terrible was about to happen. "We'll go for a walk after breakfast," Amelia said softly, but her words seemed to carry an ominous undertone. "There's a small creek nearby. Lucas used to love playing there." Jack nodded stiffly, his mind swirling with worries and doubts. Amelia acted as though they were having a normal vacation, but the contrast between her calm behavior and the discomfort in his chest made everything feel even stranger. That morning, Amelia led Jack down the tree-lined path to the small creek she had mentioned. The sound of the bubbling water echoed through the trees, but for Jack, the sound only added to his isolation and fear. Amelia continued telling stories about Lucas and Derek, as if nothing were amiss, but Jack couldn't focus on what she was saying. He was trying to figure out how to escape this place. Suddenly, Amelia stopped at the edge of the creek, turning to face Jack with a sharp look he had never seen before.